On April 6, 2022, I spoke with local spiritual innovator, learned Jew, and Rabbi, Mathew Ponak. Matt gives insight into individual spiritual experience, Jewish mysticism, embodied Kabbalah, and where academic thought meets somatic spirituality. We also chat about his soon-to-be published book, Embodied Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism for All People. Plus, Matt also shares a beautiful secular and spiritually inclusive interpretation of Passover for everyone.
I'm very interested in the meeting place of tradition and innovation. So most people think about religions more broadly as these storehouses of ancient custom and tradition. You know, maybe there's some wisdom there. Some people might not think that, but it's a whole lot of old stuff is probably the stereotype that a lot of people, especially in the more secular world, think about religion. And so, though I can't speak too broadly about religion as a whole, because if there's anything that studying Judaism for decades has taught me, it's that it's such a vast world out there that it's impossible even to summarize my own religion. But I will say, if I could be so bold as to make a generalization about Judaism, that as much as Judaism is a tradition, which upholds and passes on and perpetuates, if you will, ancient systems, it's also an innovation, or rather a series of innovations that have changed it drastically throughout the ages. So what happens most commonly when you have religious structure that's being passed down and not innovated on for a while is a lot of people start to feel like it's kind of stagnant and have a desire to leave or update it or some combination of the two. They might feel torn about it. Oh, I have a Jewish identity, but I don't really like this stuff. What I do like is my yoga class or my healing crystals or my mindfulness meditation or my therapist. And so that interface between what's alive for people, what makes them feel happy or fulfilled or motivated or passionate or makes them dream big, and the storehouse of Jewish wisdom, that's the interface that I am most interested in, the meeting place between tradition and what's new in the world.
I really love that. I love that. Thank you. Thank you for taking us down a really great introduction of your thinking and your processing. Tradition meets the new world. If you want to talk about what being Jewish really means to you, because it's such a unique thing and it's very individualized without for lack of a better word, let's say. I don't know. I think that when I talk to any Jewish person, myself included, it's always like a slightly different definition. So if you want to go there, that would be really cool.
Yeah. And along the way, I want to loop back to something you asked about, do I identify as a rabbi? And I noticed after I introduced myself that I didn't use the word rabbi, and that was to some degree an error. You know what I mean? I could have said, I'm Rabbi Mathew Ponak. And there is something about the title rabbi that I'm not entirely comfortable with, even though I have studied for many years to gain an ordination from a very respected institution. I am a rabbi by all modern definitions. I did the work, I have the title, and sometimes that word comes with a lot of weight. So whether I like it or not, people meet me. If they meet me as Rabbi Mathew Ponak, right away, I represent something. And that can vary from person to person what I represent, but it's usually not something really casual. Or if I told them that I was a professional window washer, which used to be my job several years ago, most people would say, oh, cool. And they might have associations with that, but nothing. If I say I'm a rabbi, it means a whole lot to a whole lot of people. And I think the way that I really view it is I am a Jewish person who has gone down a path of education. And now I have attained a certain status in that education. But it's not to some degree any more or less than that. Yeah, I have a spiritual life. It means a lot to me. I pass that on. I have my spiritual life interact with this learning that I've done. But I don't like being put on a pedestal, because sometimes with titles like rabbi, that's kind of naturally, there's a sort of a reverence that's given. And I think everyone should be respected. And there's this part of me that's uncomfortable with gaining extra respect when I meet new people because of my title. So I see myself as a learned Jew, someone who's gone down a path. I want to talk about it. I want to share it. But the hierarchy of someone being ordained and someone not, I'm not terribly into. I think it's more about where can we meet? And a lot of my classes, certainly the one-on-ones, but also in a group, I try to have it as much as possible a shared experience, a learning together where I can present a text and share some ideas. But the hope is there's enough space for people to engage and share and actually generate something new in the moment that I could not possibly bring on my own. And so when I think about what it means to be Jewish, I think about things like that. I think about these values like discussion and debate, not just debate to kind of best people, but debate for the sake of learning and growth. That some of the things about being Jewish that matter most to me are the things that I think are just applicable in everyday life, that aren't, what do you do in synagogue is to some degree an interesting question, but most Jewish people, let's say, who are below the age of 40, okay, and probably you could say 50 or even 60, are not participating in synagogue life on a daily, weekly, monthly, maybe a yearly basis. It's not a very active part of their lives. So the question of what does your ritual practice look like, I don't think that's the most generative conversation. Now, doesn't mean I don't want to have that conversation, but if I think about like the things that are the tip of my tongue about being Jewish, I think about things like sharing wisdom and debate and dialogue as a religious practice, that it's not, let's drink from the well of knowledge, and it's a unidirectional kind of thing. It's more, oh, well, you have some in your cup and you have some in yours. And, like there's actually different perspectives here and different flavors of wisdom. And I find the water from my well particularly refreshing, but you know what? I'm going to venture out and see what someone else has tapped into. So other examples of that, Judaism for the last 2,000 years, give or take, has been a tradition without a monastic class or caste, without monks, without our temple priests basically ceased having the same role and relevance 2,000 years ago with the destruction of our temple. And so the people who took up the mantle were householders. They weren't people who were separate from the community. They were people who had jobs, some kind of trade, livelihood. They were people who were having families. And so a lot of Jewish wisdom is very embodied. It's about finding a balance between the spirit and the body, or between the sacred and the everyday. So something like Shabbat, the seventh day of the week, the day of rest, yeah, it is a ritualized, prayerful, blessing-oriented, all of these things that are maybe more particularly culturally Jewish. And it's also a testament to to work-life balance. That the essence of Shabbat is that we shouldn't just work and work and work and work and work. That every so often we need to say to ourselves, everything is good. When we work, we're implicitly saying that something isn't right. There's something to work on. And that's true. Always, that's true. There's always more to do. But the Jewish message that's very universal is that, yes, there's always more to do, but in the same way and in the same sense, there's always something to celebrate. That we can find ways to relax and tune in and just be grateful. And that's what Shabbat's about. So I could go on, but basically it's about the balance between, what is Jewish and what is relevant. And the things that I tend to associate and be proud of and happiest and like to talk about the most are the things that I think can be a valuable addition to a global conversation or a communal conversation or a city conversation that a lot of people are having right now.
I love that. I also really appreciate you using the essay label, I put that in air quotes, but label as learned Jew. I think that's really cool. And I think in many ways, even that's what I sort of associate with you in your world. And, Rabbi is a really heavy duty title. Like there's no way around it. It is a really heavy duty, like, all right, that's a solid label or solid, handle to have. And it can be just as oppressive as it is just as empowering. I think that's an interesting balance there when it comes to responsibility, or just even, association we have with different names. But being a learned Jew, let's talk about your academics and just how much of an academic person you are and how much that's really informed, a lot of your work and even what you're doing right now. You're sitting in a UVic office in the UVic, religious studies department. It's very cool. You've got, all of your stuff lined up. You're working on a book. Let's hear about this. How do you integrate the two? Although I think some people would totally get that right off the bat. Some might not. How is there that integration between this? And, let's talk about your academics.
Sure. So a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago or something, I had a conversation with a friend. I was living in Boulder, Colorado at the time, and had just finished my master's degree in contemplative religions from Naropa University, which is a Buddhist inspired university. Now, I'd gone there on this sort of global universal quest for spirituality, to study world religions and engage with them in meditation and mysticism. And that was where I kind of got turned or called to be a rabbi, which was somewhat ironic, but also part of the magic of that place is it usually people in the program that I was in either return to their root tradition where they came from or become Buddhist. So I happen to be the kind of person that returned to their root tradition, but with new eyes, right? That Naropa was very open. It was not about convincing, converting. It was like, here's some knowledge. Is this going to help you? If the answer is yes, come learn more. And that's basically how I came to approach Judaism. So after that degree, I was talking to an old friend on the phone, and I was saying rather passionately that one of the issues is that the stories she and I had been told growing up, whether directly or indirectly, about Judaism. So we went to a Jewish day school, went to a fairly secular, but still, I guess, traditional stories in many cases about who we were and where we came from, and Moses on Mount Sinai, and God wrote the Torah. And though it wasn't taken so seriously, there was never any attempt to kind of deconstruct it either. Oh, did you know that biblical archaeology shows that it's very unlikely that all of these people left Egypt simultaneously? And did you know there's probably two different versions of the creation narrative in the book of Genesis itself, if you analyze the language? Like, that wasn't a conversation we had, which to some degree I understand. It's hard to like have kids buy in to a system while breaking it down. Regardless, things that I learned in academics, in the academic study of religion, really challenged that. So I was saying, on the one hand, the story of Judaism and the Jewish people we inherited was beautiful, and it was kind of filled us with pride and a sense of purpose in the world. A lot of it was about being a good person, right? Or maybe just the sense of like the Jewish role on earth and how it led up to Israel and our, reclamation of the land, which is really another conversation, which I'm happy to have if you want. But the point is, it was this narrative arc, and there was a certain mythic beauty to it. And on the other hand, we had the religious studies stories, which were not what I would describe as beautiful, but they were much more true. As far as I could tell, they were based on like research and study, not of what does the Torah say or what does the Talmud say, any of these texts. It was more, what can we find out about how this all was written or why it was written? What was the context? What were people initially intending with these? But when I was learning that in my undergrad, especially, I found it very confusing and existentially challenging. And I wasn't inspired, quite the opposite. I felt let down. And some days I was depressed because I was reading too much academic study of things like, the Bible or Jewish mysticism, my favorite topic. It was just, oh, well, this isn't what you thought it was. It's actually that. And I didn't feel inspired. So I said to my friend, I want to tell the story of the Jewish people in a way that isn't a lie and doesn't suck. It was that simple. Like, how can we take this truth that, again, though truth is hard to pin down, there's certainly more truth in the religious studies camp than there was in sort of like the standard traditional, I guess you could say, Jewish education for children. So how do we take that information and tell it in a way, or sift through it in a way that it's meaningful and inspiring? In essence, that's what I'm doing. And there's never an end to learning new things, but as a rabbi, as opposed to a professor, it's about the delivery method. So how can I use this piece of information about the Zohar, the sort of medieval magnum opus of Jewish mysticism? How can the fact that I maybe understand more of its original intent be inspiring to people as opposed to deflating?
That's gorgeous. That's beautiful. I love it. That's fantastic. And you're writing a book, which is wonderful because, like, come on. If you've done this amount of research and you've gone through that many trials and tribulations academically and spiritually, you've got to write it down in a book. You've got to share that. And that there's an example of expression of knowledge and sharing it. How's that going? Because you're working on a second one now too. You've got two.
Yeah.
My
So
gosh.
isn't it funny that, sometimes you're finishing one project and another one is popping up simultaneously. So here I am. This is called CSRS. My office is in the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. And I was invited sort of, I feel miraculously almost, I really feel blessed to be here, that to basically propose a project. And I'm here for several months, and I'm writing book 2, which is about how can Shabbat, the Jewish practice of rest and spiritual refreshment, I'm writing a table-side guide to a universal version. Basically, traditional, quote unquote, traditional. Yeah, I always have to put that in quotes, because what is tradition? Tradition is constantly changing. But when most people think about traditional Judaism, and Shabbat, there's this little book that goes on the table, and it has blessings and it has songs and guides to ritual. So I'm basically writing one of those that could be used, hopefully, by anyone that wants to tap into this restful, refreshing oasis in time. So that's the project. It's just starting. And meanwhile, I'm in the final editing phase of a book that is officially going to be called Embodied Kabbalah. And the subtitle is Jewish Mysticism for All People. So it is both translation and commentary on spiritual Jewish texts that articulate a Jewish language of embodiment and somatic introspection and inner transformation. By that I mean, you could find this in a variety of schools of thought, this idea that when we tune into the actual physical sensations of our body, that they can give us information about our emotions and about our buried thoughts, our subconscious. And ultimately, if people have that orientation, if they journey far enough in that perspective, you can find the soul, you can find spirit, you can find something that doesn't fit the standard categories of mind, at least in our culture. So Embodied Kabbalah lays out sort of on these Talmud style pages, which means the actual text itself that I've translated. Sometimes it's been translated for the first time, which is really cool. The first time it's appearing in an English translation, and that's in the center. And then all around it are commentaries, some of them just explaining what it means, because you can have it in English and it won't make sense sometimes because the symbolic language is very rich. And so they might quote 10 different biblical references to explain a point, and you don't have to dig them all up to understand it, because I'm explaining line by line what's going on. And it also has comparisons to other religions sometimes, or to psychology. There's reflections, there's practices you can do on some of the pages about the author. And it's supposed to be a whole introduction to texts from the Jewish tradition, which articulate this sense of transformation that can come from embodied practice and sensing into the body, different forms of Jewish enlightenment, which is not always even accepted as a thing. Some people say, oh, Jews don't have enlightenment like Buddhists have enlightenment, this sort of final phase. And there's about 6 or 7 different versions of Jewish enlightenment included in the book to challenge that to some degree and just articulate the great diversity of what could be. So it's that idea of having a balance between being a alive, awake, conscious, striving being and trying to go beyond where we are. That some people call spirituality. And simultaneously, how can we do that and maintain our balance and our footing on the ground? So sometimes some of these sources say it's a good idea to stop engaging with those practices because they might be overwhelming and you need to take a break. And how can you do that? So it's those kinds of beautiful integrating messages articulated through Jewish text. And the other piece is that it is written so that people from any background could look at these texts and decode them and gain access, like opening the gates to a whole body of wisdom and knowledge.
That's really, I love that you've also stressed the layer of accessibility, because I think, let's be honest, especially Jewish mysticism and how it's been westernized, and esoteric practices and esoteric writing has always been associated with like a lot of gatekeeping. So that's a really nice angle to have with it, aside from it just being a very different approach. I'm like I've said before, I'm really looking forward to when that book is released and it's published, because it sounds fantastic and I'm so very excited. And I really loved, because I was going to ask you if you wanted to talk more about what embodiment is and the connection between it and somatic practices, but you gave a really beautiful introductory outline for folks. So I think it's a really great opportunity for us to, perhaps, if you'd like to, because you don't want to give away all of the secrets, even though you're very, keen to be, receptive to educating everybody. But where is the meeting point between embodiment and Kabbalah, right? Because sometimes, well, at least when I first came across it, I thought, well, this is really fascinating. I haven't heard of the two combined in one. And it seems new to me, but I think you might school me on it being very new, right?
Well, it in a sense, it's both new and old. There's a really amazing teaching from Maimonides, who likely preceded Kabbalah, but he talks about the changing nature of Jewish practice over time. And this is someone he authored the most thorough book of Jewish law in our history. Like, he went through every single possible law that the earlier text spoke of, and he systematized it, he reordered. Like, this is someone who, at least on the outside, was really supporting the law. But one of his books, it's often interpreted that he was hiding his actual thoughts within. I mean, this is like sort of someone who is so rational and intellectually capable that the notion that he wouldn't be able to connect A and B equals C it's preposterous. He knew what was going on, but sometimes in this book, A Guide for the Perplexed, he sets things up for a logical conclusion, but never finishes the sentence. And so the thought is, like a lot of people from hundreds of years ago, that there was actually a real dire political ramification if you were going to say something so radical. So sometimes people wrote it and they hid it. So that's part of the fun, is you actually don't know, but part of the fun is trying to decode what's going on. So the teaching is, why did Moses and the Israelites and these in the biblical era, why did God give them commandments all about the temple sacrifice and the tabernacle? And it was bringing animals to the slaughter and offering different kinds of plants, and special occasions had different, basically, offerings. And he says, because today in his era, in the 1200s, we do prayer and we fast, and those are our main practices. So what's the deal with all this sacrifice stuff? And he says, well, the context of the Israelites is that they were living in a world of sacrifice. If that is how it was done, wouldn't it have been weird if they had had a prophet come to them and tell them, no, you're not going to sacrifice. What you're going to do is pray and fast. And then he says that would be like someone in our era, aka the 1200s, coming, some prophet, and saying, don't pray and fast, you should meditate. So the implication, and Maimonides was a meditator, he was doing silent contemplation as his philosophy. The implication is that he thought one day the Jewish people would move to another phase after prayer and fasting, after the synagogue service, so to speak, and into another phase. So even if there were no ancient Kabbalistic teachings on embodiment practices, on feeling into our embodied experience, a text like that from Maimonides really frees up what it means, right? That's an innovation text. That's a text that says, yes, it's good to be in line with all the tradition, everything that's ever been, and we change sometimes, and we go through different eras and phases. So and with that permission, so to speak, from like one of the greatest Jewish minds of all time, I will also say that if you read enough mystical Jewish sources, you will find peppered throughout these ideas about embodiment. And in one text from Moses Cordovero, who's one of these child geniuses who was studying Kabbalah as a teenager, he wrote an encyclopedia of 16th century Kabbalah at the age of 27, covered all of every time. I mean, one of these really remarkable figures. And he has a text, which I actually think might have been drawn from an earlier source from hundreds of years earlier, but it basically says, you know how some people like to say that God doesn't have a face and God doesn't have a hand, that even though it says in the Torah that God has a body, we don't actually think that, that's a metaphor. Moses Cordovero basically says, oh, no. God has a face and God has a hand and God has eyes and God has legs, but we don't. We don't actually know what those are. God's face isn't a metaphor for us to understand God. Actually, our face is a metaphor for God's face, that we are a symbolic representation. If we tune into the true nature of our hands, we will discover the capital H hand that lies beneath it and the capital F foot that is beneath our feet, that it is possible to tap into our subtle body through proper living. So that's one example. And I mean, there's many, many examples. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov from the late 18th century, early 19th century says, it's very important to be compassionate to our bodies because our soul is constantly trying to tell our bodies really remarkable things. But if we don't treat our bodies right, they won't be in a place to hear it. So self-care, in other words, will allow us to have spiritual realizations in a much deeper way. And so, look, I could quote, hundreds of sources, but the idea is that our bodies are a portal, are a gateway, are an opening towards the spiritual world. And Kabbalah has layers of spiritual reality. So the first layer, called Malchut or the Shekhinah, which means presence, essentially, divine presence, is in this orientation, access to the body. That when we tap in, at some point we start to feel that maybe there's a glow in our body. There's something more than just what we thought was there. There's a subtle sense that we can tap into and awaken. And through that subtle sense, we can gain access to the whole universe of potential in that Kabbalistic journey.
Thank you for saying that. That's gorgeous. I think that's wonderful for listeners to hear that. I think one thing that's fun about sharing this kind of stuff with anybody listening, because there's anybody tunes into CFEV, anybody tunes into any of these things, and some people are Jewish, some people are aware of Jewish concepts and mysticism and studies, some people are not. So it's really great for them to learn about this interesting connection, or this really beautiful connection that's relatable from a lot of different perspectives. So I just have to bring this up because I think you could probably take this into a lot of fun directions. Do Jews meditate? Is there any sort of record of Jews meditating? Is that a thing that happens in a religious and spiritual sense?
Yes. And to some degree, it depends how you define meditation. But if we're going to define meditation as working with our inner world in a conscious way to affect some kind of change, you could include prayer in meditation. And also, even though it's tempting, I think, for people today to look at a sacrificial culture that brings offerings, certainly in the West. I mean, you can go to Thailand and you can be part of, you're not bringing animals, but you're making offerings to temples. If you go there, it's a very accessible thing to do. And that is extremely meditative. It brings a presence, it brings a power. I mean, essentially, I think with the right definition, you could say that, Judaism is nothing but meditation. And I think for the sake of being a little bit more connective with where people are today, which when people think meditation, most people are thinking mindfulness these days, which again is a distilled Buddhist tradition that's made its way into the inner recesses of our culture. You can find things like that going back at least 1,000, 1,500 years and earlier, even in the Jewish tradition. And a couple examples. In the 16th century Kabbalistic style called Lurianic Kabbalah, there was a very elaborate set of visualizations that people would do. And some people are still doing them today, but they're so complicated, it's not a common practice. But any ritual act, and including some new ones that they were just doing, they essentially, you could, in your mind, while you're doing, let's say you're waking up in the morning and there's a prayer you say in the morning, or it's Shabbat, it's in the start. And so while you're entering into this ritual moment, you're doing a visualization in your mind of combining different divine names and breaking them apart and adding them back together. And the idea is you're actually affecting a change in the higher realms of existence at the same time that you're doing something with your body. Because in Lurianic Kabbalah, they believe that the world and the spiritual world was fragmented and broken, and that human beings could play a part in repairing it. Using these specific meditations paired with physical acts, And that is actually the most fleshed out early version of the term tikkun olam, which means repairing the world or healing the world. Today, most people think about it more in a social justice sense, right? Of like, or charity, or doing something in the world, but its original meaning was as this very esoteric meditation that people would do. And another example is Abraham Abulafia. His method, he was a early Kabbalist in the 14th century, I believe. And what he was doing was using head movements and breathing patterns. He was pronouncing different letters, and he would do it in a very meditative fashion, moving his head to one side, saying a sound, to the middle, saying a sound, to the left. He was doing things where he was spontaneously writing, and he was writing in Hebrew, but he said you could do it in any language, just a pouring out of anything. And this metaphor, he said, of untying the knots of the soul. And he has descriptions of leaving your body as you're doing this. And step one, leave your body and come back, those kinds of things. So he had a ton of different meditations he was teaching. You can find them throughout Jewish history. And those are some of the more, I guess, fleshed out or pronounced ones, but it's been around in various forms for a long, long time.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for going there. Okay. I think, well, obviously we could talk about so many awesome directions or different topics under the umbrella of your subject, embodied Kabbalah. But I think I should also, enable you to save some of that so we don't give it all away in one chat. And since it is connected and we haven't actually had a chance to touch on it yet, you also have a full organization, for lack of a better word, correct me on that, Makora. And that's another way that people can learn more about what you do, but also, rather than me try and describe that right now, why don't you explain what Makora is?
So Makora is primarily online, though increasingly, as we're moving into a new phase of living, hopefully endemic as opposed to pandemic. I don't think I'd ever say hopefully endemic previously, but here we are. It'll be more in person in Victoria, British Columbia, but it's a place to find out about online classes. It's a way to connect with me as a spiritual counselor. My wife, Mathew Ponak, is going to be offering listening sessions as a professional listener, and as well as partnerships where people can basically sign up to be in a space where they know everyone's vetted and they can give each other exchanges of listening. That mental health and the need for catharsis and self-expression, it's almost never been higher. And listening partnership is a space in which you can have a mutual exchange and give people a chance to voice and have the opportunity to listen, and then have someone to listen to you to just process ideas. And that can be primarily online at this point. So Makora is a spiritual center that is inspired by Jewish values and Jewish spiritual ideas, but by no means limited to Jewish people or the Jewish religion. It is everything from a space to connect one-on-one with a teacher for private Kabbalah classes or spiritual counseling, a place where you can participate in a class, and hopefully over time, a place where there'll be an online community of learners and innovators and practitioners who can meet together for all of those activities and more.
Sweet. Well, also you've been doing some events at the Multi-Faith Center at UVic, which is cool. I'm just thinking it would be really fun if you want to comment on the connection between mental health care, let's say, or mental health self-treatment or self whatever, and spiritualism, because there is definitely a connection between the two, between mental health treatment and care and spiritualism.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in my previous existence, I was a mental health support worker. That between Naropa and my rabbinical school, I worked at a Buddhist psychology institute called Windhorse in Colorado. It was a really beautiful experience. And we were supporting people who had not sort of everyday style of mental health challenges. This is people who were suffering from things like psychosis or quite profound OCD and things like that. So I really feel strongly about helping people with their mental health hygiene and supporting people in a journey of recovery. So these song circles that we're doing, I guess if I were to relate it specifically to mental health, it's a place where people can connect. It's a place where you can find people who like to sit and sing, people who are looking for connection. And the experience of the songs that we're doing, it's from the Nigun tradition, which it's primarily wordless melodies sung with syllables. They're repetitive in the sense, it's not like a whole composition. And the invitation is to sing along, and people join their voices. So they're relatively short melodies. They repeat, they go louder and quieter, they go faster, they're slower sometimes. And the idea is it's really just going with the flow. So we sing together. Sometimes a song can last 5 minutes, sometimes it can last 15 minutes. And afterwards, there's an invitation into silence. The experience for most people of the silence is that it's a much more profound, a louder, more noticeable silence, if you will, after the singing has finished. So I usually give over some teachings and some stories, but it's really just a place for people to, in person, connect, to sing together, and everyone's welcome if they want to, socialize afterwards. People are still navigating their own sense of social distancing and what they feel comfortable with, but increasingly, as the restrictions have been lifted, there's a real sense of community that's been developing there. And I think that there are few things in the world more powerful for good mental health than a nourishing and enriching community.
True. It is. Yeah, it takes a village, as they say, right? Now, this really relates quite nicely. You also are a musician yourself, and that obviously plays a big role in the singing circles. Would you like to chat a little bit about the music that you do, and perhaps even where there might be some spiritual and cultural connections that are part of your musical practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I first was introduced to this tradition of singing, specifically the Nigun tradition, which is a few hundred years old. It's a Hasidic tradition originally from Eastern Europe. I was introduced as a teenager, and it really, in the most simple sense, it's just people singing wordless melodies. Nine, 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 nine. Right? You can use different syllables, and they repeat. And there's something that similarly to feeling into the body. I mean, you can feel like you've got a pain in your gut. Everyone knows what that feeling is like, unfortunately, right? You have a knot in your chest that can be associated with stress, or sometimes if you feel wonderful, try feeling into your heart center and notice what's going on there. Often when people are feeling great joy, there's this really warm feeling in their chest. And it is also possible to feel into your body and say, this is just my body. What am I supposed to be doing here? So similarly, you can have this melody, and if you sing it 2 or 3 times through, you might say, oh, that was nice. Or maybe you'll say, I don't know, that wasn't really for me. Or maybe you'll say, I'm curious, but I don't really know why I'm doing this. But if you take that same melody, especially with someone who is trained and has tapped into that flow that can be associated and can come along with that kind of singing, you can take that melody and you can sing it slowly at first. You can go through it once, and then the next time it'll be a little bit faster. And there's actually no specific formula for where that melody needs to go, but someone who's trained, and by trained, I really mean someone who's exposed themselves enough to that tradition that they can start to lead and really let the melody lead them. And so pretty soon you're going on this journey together, and that melody, which might have seemed simple or on the surface, ends up being this gateway to something beyond. And it's not uncommon for people who are engaging with that practice and really going deep with it to just feel this profound sense of stillness or calm in the midst of this shifting, moving wave of melody and the emotion and the feelings that come with. And at the end of that, there's this silence. And in the silence, sometimes just things arise within people. So sometimes, like I've been in places in Jerusalem where people are singing like that. There's 500 people in a room and they're singing these melodies for hours. And there's something really, really powerful about it. And so when I do all sorts of music, but the stuff that I offer most often publicly looks like that. And it's inspired by, some of them are actually traditional tunes. Some of them are original tunes. You can take things like Ozzy Osbourne's Iron Man and turn it into a nigun. Just take away the words and go lie, 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 lie. And those are sometimes the most fun because everyone knows it and they can sing along. It's if you're learning a new melody, it can be harder, but if you get one that people already know, there's a lot of potential there to really go for it. So a lot of my music, I'm playing guitar, I'm singing. Often my wife Melina will sing along, and she harmonizes or joins in. We have percussion sometimes from a friend, Mark Helbert, who plays the tabla live. It's really, really beautiful stuff. Also, part of my influence is I've played the banjo since I was a teenager. And so I don't use it as much these days, but sometimes if someone has a guitar, I'll take my banjo, and I have a whole album of banjo style niguns. Many of them are original, some traditional, but the album's called Bridges of Song. You can see it's on Spotify and all the services. And so it's under Mathew Ponak. But I'm a fan of the Grateful Dead and the Fish and those kinds of jam bands. And so I have a real love of improvisation. Sometimes I write a set list when I do the song circles, but most of the time I throw it out, even if I have it, because it's such an in the moment experience that at the end of a nigun and the silence that follows, what I'm doing is I'm feeling into the space, using that body centered sense and asking really what I would call the Shekhinah, right? The presence that's there. Like, what's next? Like, what does this space need to take it to the next level or the next exchange or the next place? So it's a really intuitive art. And I think in a lot of ways, it's how I think about religion as well. Like, we all have the set list, all rabbis, they learn the set list, it's like, this is what we do at this holiday and this prayer service. And here's this teaching for this occasion. Yeah, there's a lot of room, but sometimes you got to throw out the whole set list and just say, what do we need right now in this moment today, and right now in our history?
Sweet. That's really great. I love hearing that. And I think everyone tuning in is going to appreciate it. This is being aired in the middle of Passover because I've put a lot of planning into having this interview with you, but it's being aired. It's the 20th of April, which is also not only a notorious religious holiday for Jews, but also for other people. Is there a connection between Passover, Kabbalah, and cannabis? Can we go there? Is there
so there has been in the last couple of years an archaeological study in the land of Israel that found on one of the old temple altars, because there actually were multiple altars in different parts of Israel, but they found cannabis residue. And so that is a really interesting discovery. There's no way of saying for certain what was going on there, but I like to think that it was part of someone's ritual. Just like acacia bark from the acacia tree could also be some type of hallucinogen. Apparently there's been findings where they have seen that in some of the ritual wine. Now that I can't say with absolute certainty, but it wouldn't be surprising if there was some engagement with mind-altering substances besides alcohol in the ancient world. There's in a section of the Torah where it's describing the anointing oil on the altar, like an oil that was used to anoint the altar. And it says one of the plants in Hebrew is called kaneh bosem, which some people translate as cannabis. Again, nobody knows, but the fact that there's now archaeological evidence that it was there, it says something. So Passover is a holiday which, like every Jewish holiday of that time, every Israelite festival, involved not just things going on in houses or in the community, but things happening specifically ritually in the temple. So I don't think it would be so outlandish to think that there was cannabis used on Passover, right? At some point, at some temple in ancient Israel, though surely there's no way of knowing it. But if I had to tie it all together, that's how I would do it. Now, to be more, I guess, in depth, or to take a closer look at, you could say Kabbalistically, a really Hasidic mysticism fleshes this out. It's sort of a movement that came after Kabbalah, starting in the 1700s. And they say that Passover, the essence of it has to do with that story about the Exodus from Egypt. And metaphorically or psychologically, what is that? It means, so in Hebrew, the ancient name of Egypt is Mitzrayim, and Mitzrayim is related to a word, or can be etymologically broken down to mean a narrow place or the narrows. So this idea that the Israelites left the land of Canaan, they journeyed to Egypt, and they became enslaved in a narrow place. All of us know the experience of having a constricted feeling in our minds and our bodies and our hearts. whenever we're in a horrible mood, or we're feeling anxious, or things are really a big question, and you might feel fear, something looming, that's a constricted place. So in Jewish mysticism, the Exodus is an inner journey as much as it was a historical journey of Israelites out of Egypt and out of literal slavery, that in any moment where we're feeling a constriction, the journey from that into a liberated feeling is the mystical, spiritual inner message of Passover. It's a celebration of that potential and that journey. And so there's this idea of an inner exodus that all of us, because we're human, are going to have moments where we feel constricted, even a phase in our lives where we feel that we're incapable of that real free movement. But what happened when the Israelites left is they had that liberation, that amazing feeling that comes with overcoming something like that. And because of that experience, they merited a revelation. They inherited the Torah. Like, this whole wisdom lineage came to them because they earned it through that difficult experience and moving out of it eventually. So similarly for us, every person, if we are able to be present with an experience like a constriction experience in such a way that we can not just transcend it, but actually work with it, allow it to change and grow and transform, we have that liberating, cathartic experience. And we usually have an insight that comes along with it. Oh, I never realized that. You know, one of those aha moments. And the last phase that the Israelites are instructed is to build a tabernacle, is to, here's a book of laws, now go live it. So in many ways, the mystical journey isn't complete until we start living that in the world, that we can have a constriction moment, a liberation, a revelation, but action is the completion of the cycle when we can put that into our lives.
You know, that really summarizes so much, I think, that people miss when it comes to the spiritualism, the mysticism, and also, of course, the religious aspects of Judaism, is all of the symbolism, right down to our language. Hebrew has so much symbolism. There's so much double meaning. I know double meaning can imply the wrong term I'm using. Like I said, I'm not firing on all cylinders, but there's that beautiful double meaning, that beautiful metaphor that you can look into and really gain a lot from. Thank you for talking about that. I really appreciate it. I would love to talk more, of course, and I think that we could talk about so many more things. We could talk about that beautiful picture that's just behind your head. We could talk more about Kabbalah. We could talk more about your music. But I'm just going to give you the chance. Is there anything that you would like to sort of finish off the interview with, and that I just haven't given space for? And you know, it's come to you, you know, throughout our conversation. You want to share it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So what comes to me to share is not sort of a piece of information about me or my body of work. It's more just a blessing for people who are listening, that they are able to find sort of what they're needing in this moment in history, in this moment in their lives, that each of us has access to really a storehouse of riches within ourselves, within our bodies, within our minds. And sometimes we can think about a lot of different strategies for how to kind of fix what we're going through or change something. But the idea within Kabbalah, within the kind of Jewish mysticism that I practice, is the experience of finding the inner truth in ourselves, the reason why we're experiencing what we're experiencing, what's underlying that pain or that suffering. Simply finding that truth is the spark that it needs to begin to change. So I want to just offer that to all the listeners, that they find whatever truth they're needing in this moment that can help them move and journey and continue to grow and find their path and their calling.
Thank you for chatting with me, Matt, and sharing your love for spiritual investigation. I appreciate the care you take in your esoteric research and how you make it so very accessible to everyone. Please be sure to check out Mekorah Insitute, catch Matt in person at the next Sacred Singing Circle, as well as keep an eye out for the launch of his book, Embodied Kabbalah, Jewish Mysticism for All People. All this info and more can be found at www.makora.com.